Let's start with Alexander. Yes, I've known Mr. Wallasch or Alexander for, well, quite a few years. Alexander has a very successful independent news media platform that has more reach than many large German daily newspapers. And unlike large daily newspapers in Germany, he also has a loyal audience that supports him financially.
Und anders als große Tageszeitungen hat er auch ein treues Publikum, die ihn unterstützen, mental, aber auch finanziell.
He is a brave person. Previously, Alexander worked in Germany for other publications, so he is a really battle-tested journalist. What kind of reach does his website have? I'm not totally sure, but he certainly has 200,000 readers a month on his platform. And how long has he been working as a journalist? As journalist, he certainly has been working for 20 years or so. I don't know exactly, I wasn't his employer. I got to know him as a lawyer originally and as an interview partner. He's a really experienced man, very good, and above all, a kind man. So he doesn't do things just to help himself, but he always jumps into topics others do no longer even want to report about. So that's interesting. So why don't others want to report? Now we have already reached the huge political issue of German censorship and the counterpart to German censorship, which is the self-censorship of those affected. Of course, Article 5 of the Basic Law, which is the German Constitution, states that censorship does not take place. But this is only a noble concept, unlike in the US, where freedom of speech can be enforced. In our country, freedom of expression is limited by the so-called general laws. This is what the Constitution says, and the general laws can restrict freedom of expression according to a very complicated constitutional interpretation. This means that we have a system in Germany that is increasingly curtailing freedom of expression, not by doing it formally and explicitly, but by doing it in a million individual pieces and at the same time dramatically increasing the price people have to pay for expressing their own opinions. This means criminal prosecution, loss of one's profession, economics or tax disadvantages, all sorts of things in order to intimidate people. At the same time, the freedom of expression and the freedom of the press are anchored in the German Constitution. How does that go together? Well, this is a long story. The history of the American Constitution is known to most readers and listeners, but in Germany, the Constitution does not begin until 1948 with the end of fascism and the end of the occupation. Back then, because of what the National Socialists had done, it was very important that we went back to the freedom of expression. And that was put into the Constitution, and freedom of speech was particularly restricted at the beginning. There were some state press laws in Germany, which means that, similar to the American federalist system, each federal state has its own state press law, but that was more a law of order. That means they made sure that the press was observing certain formalities. And according to the state press laws, there was no censorship in Germany whatsoever. Similar to the US, there are also a few criminal speech offenses in Germany. One is insult, and the other is slander. Insult is an opinion that someone expresses about you, and slander is an untrue fact that is voiced about someone. But then, over time, additional criminal offenses were added to the law, such as incitement to hatred. Incitement to hatred was something that had already entered the political sphere, had been in the law for many, many years, but had never really entered reality, and was a law that wasn't applied often and hardly ever led to any judicial verdicts. And that has changed dramatically in recent years. That's very interesting. Incitement to hatred. What exactly is meant by this? That could be all sorts of things depending on how it's interpreted. It could be interpreted very broadly. How is it interpreted? Your question is already half of the answer. I have been a lawyer since 1991 and I cannot tell you exactly what it means. Of course, I can read the article to you. So, incitement to hatred is a very critical statement that is directed against groups and which is so affected that the public becomes incited, so that public order and public safety are no longer guaranteed. Today, in practice, unpopular expressions of opinion against certain groups are considered incitement to hatred. So if I say something extreme, for example, all Jews are bad people, then that could be incitement to hatred. But German law is strange. If, for example, an immigrant were to say that all Germans are fascists or Nazis, that is not incitement to hatred, because the German people cannot be insulted. This is not written in the law, but this is how the law is being interpreted. Interesting. What if someone says that all voters of the political party AfD are evil people? The political sphere is not affected. I mean the party political sphere. So if I now attack the AfD in the context of the political dispute, it is not incitement to hatred, and the same is true when I attack the Social Democratic Party, the SPD. It has to affect certain ethnic or religious groups. The Syrians and the Turks in Germany are considered an ethnic group, but Germans are not. They are not an ethnic group in the sense of the law. This means that Germans are treated significantly worse than minorities in the country within the framework of this law. So that doesn't make sense. Why are Germans not an ethnic group? Because they are, so to speak, the bearer of the law and are therefore not capable of being offended. That's not what the law itself says, but judges have interpreted it that way. Germans are incapable of being offended? Exactly, not as a group. If I said all Germans should die, then I could say that. But that would not be incitement to hatred. If I said all Syrians in Germany should die, then I could be prosecuted. And that's based on the interpretation of judges who ruled that way. Yes, that's the established case law in Germany. This means that jurisprudence is currently taking the path of systematic, whether planned or not. I'll leave open for now. The Germans have such a lovely phrase, enclosure of the law. This means in plain language that German law is being curtailed. That's what's happening through lots of judicial verdicts. Enclosure. I've never heard that word before, enclosure of the law. It's a term used in constitutional law. It used to make sure that fundamental rights would not conflict with each other, so it was a positive thing. For example, I have the fundamental right to freedom of expression, and this fundamental right to freedom of expression conflicts with the fundamental right to personal freedom. In other words, unlimited personal freedom doesn't lead to freedom of expression, and unlimited freedom of expression can massively impair personal rights. And if the two are separated from each other, the old word for that was enclosure. Okay, so I find this whole incitement to hatred very dubious. It sounds like whoever is in power is able to decide what constitutes incitement to hatred. Yes, this article has, of course, been in the law for some time, and it originally had a perfectly reasonable idea. During the Nazi era, we had the persecution of Jews and other minorities in this country, and this was carried out not only by state organs, but also by political organizations like the SA or other institutions. And the wording of the law, according to incitement to hatred or attacks against minorities, was intended to prevent a large portion of the population from being incited to act against minorities. That was the original idea. Today, however, the term incitement to hatred has taken on a completely independent meaning and is used to criminalize unpopular expressions of opinion, particularly in the area of immigration. What about this particular crime of insulting a politician? It's not a specific offense. It's a so-called qualification in plain language. That means that if there is no insult, it's also not an insult against the politician. But if I insult someone someone and they happen to be a politician, then it's an aggravating offense, and that's a particularly serious offense. This means that politicians in Germany are privileged, just like in the days before the French Revolution. So if you attack them, you get a little extra punishment. And that also applies to politicians of the Alternative for Germany, the AfD. Yes, so there's no law that says AfD politicians are exempt, but we have a dramatic erosion of the law in Germany, and the erosion of the law, and that is also known in the US. It takes place firstly in the area of unequal application of the law and then in the area of disproportionality. What does unequal application of the law mean? I can say, for example, that Mrs. Weidel, the leader of the AfD, is a Nazi bride. Yes, I'm allowed to say that. She has to tolerate that because it's protected under freedom of political speech. But if I were to say the same to the Minister of the Interior, there are judicial rulings that say, no, 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 that's going too far. You can't say that. That's delegitimizing the state. Delegitimizing the state. You cannot say that. That means the judiciary can certainly interpret and even explain individual rulings, but the inequality in the application of the law is noticeable because they say, oh, we are only hearing the case against Ms. Weidel, Mr. Schmitz, or Mr. Meyer. We're not even looking at the other one. And the public prosecutors in Germany, who are the ones who lead the prosecutions, are normally listed in the law as organs of the administration of justice, as it is called in the legal system. In fact, however, they are nothing more than the water carriers of the red-green government. They are directly subject to the government's instructions. The public prosecutors have no independent function whatsoever in Germany. It went so far that the European Court of Justice once declared that international arrest warrants issued in Germany may no longer be executed abroad because the prosecuting authority is not an independent legal entity. Wow, when was that? Oh, now you're quizzing me, and I don't remember exactly. It could have been 5 years ago. I don't know if it was 6 or 7, but it's been a few years. Okay, so it was quite recently. Yes, that wasn't 100 years ago. So it's still very much the case today. The key point, however, wasn't the issue of international arrest warrants. Rather, the court found that these bodies are not independent organs of the administration of justice, carrying the water for the government. Not even the state, but the government of the respective federal state. So, of the respective federal state. Yes, usually the state government. This is how public prosecutors are organized in Germany. First, there are the prosecutors at the regional courts. Then there are prosecutors one level up at the federal states courts. And then there is Germany's Federal Prosecutor General, who belongs to Germany's highest court, the Federal Court of Justice. This is, of course, a federal body, but all these courts currently operate in the same way. Criminal complaints against left-wing attacks are ignored, are not processed, and are deliberately and systematically ignored by the German authorities if they go in the wrong direction. How is it possible that it's so coordinated? Because, Germany is a federal country like the United States. There are federal states in Germany that are more pro-CDU and others that are more SPD states, like Hamburg, for example. You say it's the same in all states, the same discrimination, it's the same. Here it's called the two-tier justice system, a two-track justice system depending on the opinion that is being expressed. Let's put it this way. In the US, as I understand the US legally, there are, of course, quite different legal positions in the states, because they are very different. In Germany, there are actually only two groups, the SPD, together with the Green Party, and the CDU plus one or more coalition partners. We don't have a single state in Germany where the CDU governs alone. That means that the SPD and the Greens are in some form or other involved in everything. Even in Bavaria? And in Bavaria, yes, there's a coalition partner, a party called the Free Voters. So you can't find the CDU or CSU in its undiluted form anywhere in Germany. Interesting. Eugyppius, he has a Substack. I don't know if you know him. I think he's American. His English is excellent, and he knows Germany very, very well. He has lived there for probably many years. He has a Substack called The Plague Chronicle, and he recently wrote that Germany has the most insane speech restrictions of all Western democracies. Do you agree? Free speech cases, that's my daily business, so to speak. I'm a lawyer, and I also handle a lot of the usual stuff in the areas of labor law, civil law, criminal law. However, in recent years, free speech prosecutions have multiplied due to a politically dominated or compromised legal system. So let's take a simple case. In Germany, the use of the swastika and symbols from the Nazi era is prohibited for historical reasons. In other words, what's possible in America, in Germany, I'm not allowed to display swastika. In the past, that meant maybe you shouldn't hang the Third Reich flag on the front of your house, which is reasonable and which no one does in Germany. So, if you walk through the inner cities in Germany, you don't see any Nazi groups scaring women somewhere. Instead, German inner cities are dominated by groups of foreigners that attack women. The so-called skinheads with Nazi emblems, they might still exist in some movies. In reality, I personally have never seen a group like that in Germany. But whenever I read the media, I'm supposed to always be afraid of them. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe they have become invisible in the meantime. But what I wanted to say about the swastika is the following. Someone was wearing a medal, an old man from the Second World War, and of course, there was a swastika on his medal. He didn't go to the baker with the medal on his breast, but it was at some official event where everyone was wearing their medals. He wasn't allowed to wear them anymore, these war medals, because they were showing a swastika. So they had to stick a piece of plastic on top of the medal where the swastika was. Everyone knew that it was, of course, a medal from the Third Reich. And now, in the age of the internet, it's getting absurd. I have a case where someone published on May 1st, Labor Day, the National Socialist pamphlet from May 1st, 1933. That was an important day in Germany. The Nazis made May 1st a holiday. May 1st had been Labor Day before the Nazis came to power, but not as a holiday. The Nazis made it a public holiday. And of course, they did not do that because they were such big friends of workers. It was a big Nazi advertising stunt. And one of my clients published this pamphlet of the Nazis proclaiming May 1st as a public holiday, and now he is facing criminal proceedings for showing Nazi symbols. And why? On this historical flyer from 1933, there was a swastika. And my client did not write that he thought that was a good thing or something like that. He only wrote below it, the Nazis introduced May 1st as a public holiday, and for that he was prosecuted. I can tell you that this man is more right-wing conservative, not green. On the other hand, during the recent carnival here in Germany, a float drives through the inner city of Düsseldorf with Alice Weidel and a huge swastika on it, and this swastika is meant to characterize Alice Weidel, the leader of the AfD. But this then is regarded by everyone as an expression of artistic freedom at the carnival. I saw that picture, and there were others shown with the swastika in that carnival procession. It was Elon Musk or Donald Trump, one of the two, I think, who carried the swastika, which was also in the colors of the American flag. Well, I don't know about that. In the beginning, it was forbidden to display National Socialist emblems. And then this was widened to start covering other things as well. Now, National Socialist sayings can also lead to prosecutions. So, for example, if I say, everything for Germany, hooray, everything for Germany, then that is National Socialism. Nobody understands why. Everything for Germany is basically a relatively neutral expression. Period of National Socialism, I don't know, the SA or the SS, someone used it quite often as a propaganda slogan. It wasn't one of the most often used slogans, but they used that slogan. Interestingly, the SPD and even the CDU used that phrase after the war. But in the meantime, everything is a criminal offense in Germany. The AfD chairman for the state of Thuringia, Björn Höcke, was prosecuted for the use of that slogan. Now there are many books and journals in Germany that display swastikas on the title page, not to present the National Socialist period in some kind of positive light, but in a negative sense, as criticism, in comparison with some current event or development. And that's not a problem, that's legal, and nobody is prosecuted for it. We are now back in the area of unequal application of the law. Within the article that I just mentioned, there is a sentence that says it's okay to show nationalist socialist emblems like the swastika if they are used for purposes of clarification or political debate. This is the so-called restrictive regulation within the law. So, freedom of art. People can point to this restrictive regulation within the law. However, I have to mention that the legal system will not apply this regulation to all those people who are more on the conservative side or who like the AfD. For those people, prosecutors will reject this regulation, namely that they have a right to display National Socialist emblems in a negative sense. I can give you a specific case. There's a photo from the 1930s. There are girls and their children. They have small National Socialist flags in their hands. They wave. They're on the side of some road. So probably the photo doesn't show that there's some train passing by. And then someone wrote next to it that was 1933. There was no freedom of expression. People were persecuted. We never want that again. This man who wrote that next to the picture was prosecuted for displaying the picture for the use of anti-constitutional emblems, and the prosecutor did not shrink away from writing into the judgment that one cannot necessarily believe what he wrote next to the picture because he supports the AfD. The man was prosecuted because he posted this picture on social media? Yes, he had published it on Facebook. And that's why he was charged and convicted. You have to explain that to me in detail. I'll send you the picture later. The man is conservative. He is a member of the AfD, but not even particularly active with them. But he uses social media. And now we are coming full circle to my next topic. The public prosecutor now isn't investigating this individual accusation, the swastika on the photo. The files of the prosecution in such cases are sometimes 300 to 500 pages long. What do you make of that? And now there's a complete online investigation into this defendant in which he published everything. Sometimes there are 50 to 100 posts in such a file that have no criminal relevance whatsoever. And then the prosecutor goes to that one case that does, so that he can be marked, also vis-a-vis the court. So if someone, let's say a Green Party member, had posted exactly the same picture on Facebook, which is very critical of National Socialism, what would have happened?
Hätte genau dasselbe Bild auf Facebook veröffentlicht. Was wäre passiert?
Simply nothing. The public prosecutor's office wouldn't have investigated. This brings us straight to the political question, and that's the extensive networks in Germany. We have a deep state. And that's what I mean, my friends and I, find so positive about Trump. It's not what Trump does in every little detail, but the question of whether we have a deep state in Germany, which in Germany, I have to tell Trump, that is significantly deeper than in the US. You can already see that from the fact that the public sector share in GNP is significantly higher in Germany than in the US, which means that the state is responsible for dramatically more things in Germany than it is in the US, and that, of course, means a larger basis or network from where to go on the attack. But now the entire internet, and we'll come back to the Kiwi issue in a moment, is being scanned by government organizations for illegal or potentially just unlawful posts. Take the famous expression, incitement. What is incitement? I didn't even know the word until a few years ago. Of course, I knew the word incitement, but I didn't know it is a legal term. If you insulted someone, you ran the risk of being prosecuted. But even if I attacked someone in a very aggressive way, or even if I told someone, I hate you, I don't want you to do anything ever again, that is a legally irrelevant sentence. You can call it indecent, but it is not legally actionable. But nowadays, hate speech and incitement are prosecuted, even though they are not criminally prosecutable according to the law. Yes, and that's very interesting. I wanted to ask you about that. Hate speech is a crime in many European countries, but it doesn't exist in Germany, correct? There is no hate speech crime in Germany. It doesn't exist. Incidentally, it doesn't exist in most other European countries either. What influential interconnected woke groups are doing here in Germany, but also in Europe, is they are systematically and deliberately trying to destroy freedom of expression. And in that respect, the Vance speech hit the nerve in Munich. And they are doing that by making the price of expressing an opinion so high that you either simply stop doing it, or you better ask a lawyer first for simple sentences and simple images, and even lawyers are sometimes wrong. Right. And this term, incitement, it's the same term as in the expression incitement to hatred. But you say that the expression incitement on its own is a new term in the legal system in Germany. Yes, you can't be prosecuted for incitement in Germany. Why? According to our criminal code, nobody can be convicted for incitement unless it is incitement of the people, which means incitement of an entire group of people. I can say things like, I find you pretty awful. I also think you're rather dumb and moreover completely incompetent for your office. The word stupid can already be dangerous. If I call someone stupid, it could be regarded as a crime of politician insult. There's the Moran story that you mentioned earlier. It's about that, you were the idiot you were talking about. That means flippant remarks. So what constitutes an insult? It's probably the same in English as it is in German. It's sometimes a question of interpretation. There are very sensitive people for whom even a dirty look is quite insulting, and there are others. One person says asshole and then the other person says asshole back and doesn't perceive it as an insult at all. And in between, of course, there's a debate about what constitutes an insult or not. But words that have become completely normal in everyday language along the lines of you are so stupid, you are such a dumb guy, are prosecuted with varying results. There are district courts, which are lower courts, that acquit. Others higher up don't acquit. So you have a mixed situation where no longer it's clear at all what is insulting or not. And the average citizen who doesn't have the money for lengthy legal proceedings and other things and says, I'd rather not say anything. And that's precisely the aim of the political system in Germany at the moment, to destroy freedom of speech by introducing such severe threats that, powered by the other side, no one dares to say anything. And that's the intention. And that's the intention. Yes, and all in a lawless space. I mean, that's not... We had something like that in the Third Reich before. If you were a Jew walking on the streets in 1934 and you were followed and beaten by someone, by the SA, then that was a crime in 1934 too. You weren't allowed to just hit someone on the street, including Jews. So you'd then call the police, and the police looked the other way. They'd say, well, it was the SA, that's some sort of semi-governmental organization. There's nothing we can do about that, and they would walk away. Which means that although the Third Reich had complete criminal law protection almost until the very end, the law had simply been hollowed out by not enforcing it. And that is exactly what is happening today. Not that people are being beaten to death on the streets, but it's happening in the area of freedom of speech. What you just said is interesting. The SA, you said, was a semi-governmental organization. That reminds me of the NGOs, non-governmental organizations. They are also semi-governmental or even fully governmental because they're usually fully funded by the state. Well, I call them fascist front organizations because in Germany, it's probably like in America. If they don't have to ban them. You just pull the plug on the state subsidies and then they must continue to finance themselves through private donations or foundations, whatever. That would be perfectly fine in a democracy. But these groups are completely funded by the state, and I suspect that 80 to 90% of NGOs in Germany are funded by the government. When you take into account the cross-financing that's happening, which means that the state is funding the SA in Germany today. It's an opinion SA that's active here.
Das heißt, der Staat bezahlt heute die SA in Deutschland. Das ist eine Meinungs-SA, die hier stattfindet.
Do you know how much money flows from USAID to Germany? I looked that up. It was a very significant amount, well over 50 million per year. And that's the official part. The unofficial part isn't even included, because there's also bribery through advertisements.
Der inoffizielle Teil ist da gar nicht drin bei sonstigen. Es gibt ja auch die Form der Bestechung durch Anzeigen.
Tell me more about these advertisements. Well, such advertisements play a large role in bribing the German media. The state itself buys ads, not political ones, but completely apolitical ads. For example, during the COVID pandemic, it was ads, whole-page ads with information about all kinds of topics. Such ads are also placed online, and they are, of course, disseminated across the internet, but only in media that are financed by the state media. Which media are state-financed in Germany? Well, first of all, there are the public state broadcasters. The public broadcasters in Germany receive approximately 10 billion euros per year via a so-called broadcasting fee that Germans must pay. This broadcasting fee in Germany is really a special tax levied on broadcasting devices, no more and no less. But it doesn't make any difference if you listen to the state media or not. You still have to pay this tax. So that's 10 billion.
nicht mehr und nicht weniger, für Rundfunkgeräte, egal ob sie Rundfunk öffentlich-rechtlichen hören oder nicht. 10
And
Milliarden.
then the other
So,
part
die
of the
andere
media are
Sicht
the
der
large
Medien sind
private
die
media
großen
corporations in
Medienkonzerne in
Germany.
Deutschland. Das
If
sind,
you
weil
add
sie
them
sich
up under real
zusammensetzen
ownership
unter echten
structures, there are about 10 to 15, not more than that, are left in Germany today, and they run the entire German media landscape as corporate groups, conglomerates.
Konzerne, Konglomerate.
And those
Die
also
erhalten
receive
die Anzeigen.
these
Tageszeitung,
advertisements from
der
the state,
Spiegel,
the
der
big daily
Stern,
newspapers
die
like the Frankfurter
die
Allgemeine, the
Frankfurter
Frankfurter Rundschau, and the weekly
auch wenn die gar nicht mehr
magazines
auf
like der
Papier, sondern
Spiegel,
nur noch
der
online
Stern,
bestehen. Die
even if
Zeit,
they no longer
das heißt,
exist in print, but
monte
only
zutreffende
online.
Medien
The
werden
weekly
in der
newspaper Die
Institution
Zeit
vom
is
Staat
heavily funded in
finanziert.
this way by
So,
the
und wenn ich
state,
vom
and
Staat
that's true for
finanziert
all
bin,
woke
überlege ich
media
auch,
in
was ich
Germany. And if I'm financed by the state, well, then I think twice about what I'm going to write. Do you have any insight into the percentages? I mean, how heavily are these magazines and newspapers financed through these ads purchased by the state? No, I do not, and that's for two reasons. This state depends on systematic concealment.
Das heißt,
That means under private law, I
privatrechtlich muss ich
don't
ja nicht
have to
offen
disclose
sehen, wie
what
viel
percentage
Prozent
of my
meiner Anzeigen von
advertisements
staatlichen
are
Organen
from
sind. Das ist
government
ja
agencies,
im Rahmen der
within the
Privatheit
privacy
eines
of the
Unternehmens,
company.
das
That's actually their
Sprachgeheimnisse
private
verleugnet.
knowledge that does not
Und der
need to be
Staat
disclosed.
schreitet ja nicht an, also
It's not the
die Behörde
state. It's
A, die
not, let's
schreitet nicht
say,
zentral,
Agency
sondern das
A
sind
that
in den USA
purchases
so
these
ganz
ads
viele
directly
kleine
from the
Behörden,
media.
schalten
But it's like in the United States. There are
die
lots of
geben Geld
small
an eine
state agencies in
Organisation,
Germany,
diese
and they use
Organisation
other
schaltet eine
agencies whose
Anzeige.
task it is to funnel the money to some
Also man müsste
NGO,
jetzt en
and then
Detail
that
der Spur des
organization will
Geldes
purchase
folgen.
the ad.
Okay.
Also der Alexander Wallasch hat zum
So
Beispiel
you'd have to
mit
carefully
einer
follow this intricate
Organisation
money trail. For
Wahrscheinlich
example, Alexander Wallasch had a
eine
dispute with an
Auseinandersetzung gehabt, die
organization called
findet sich auch
Compact.
online.
You can find it
Da hat
online.
der Alexander
Alexander
geschrieben,
wrote that
wie
Compact was
wird
funded
von
by the state, and then they
staatlicher
demanded a
Seite
retraction
finanziert.
from him,
Darauf folgte
arguing
von
that they
ihm eine
weren't receiving any
Widerrufsbeschwerde
money
mit der
from the
Begründung,
state.
sie
Then we looked
bekämen vom
into it, and
Staat gar
indeed,
kein
they were
Geld.
actually right. They
Dann haben
weren't
wir
receiving any
nachgeguckt,
money from the
die
state,
hatten
but
recht,
their
sie kriegten vom
subsidiary
Staat gar
company
kein
was
Geld,
80%
allerdings
funded by
deren
the state.
Tochtergesellschaft ist
And
zu
this
80%
subsidiary
vom Staat
company
bezahlt
passes
worden.
contracts and financial support onto the
Die
parent company. That
Tochtergesellschaft gibt
means
wieder an die
we are dealing
Muttergesellschaft
here with a system
Aufträge
whose
und
core purpose
Finanzleistungen
is to
weiter.
conceal state
Das heißt, es ist ein
subsidies.
systematisches System der
And the
Verschleierung
purpose of the
staatlicher
state
Zuschüsse
subsidies is
zur
to
Verhinderung
impede
von
freedom of
Meinungsfreiheit.
speech in private media. Yes, that's how it is here in the USA as well.